Our next gear is practicing with feedback. Now this gear is a two-part one, so let's look at the practicing first. Practicing, well, we've heard that practice makes perfect, but that's only partially correct. Practice only makes perfect if we target the practice on the things that we most need to learn. For instance, if you're a composition teacher, there's no reason to have them write an entire 5-page composition if what you want them to get better at is just writing that beginning hook, those first couple sentences to hook in the reader to want to read the composition. What would be better to do is ask the students to write 5 completely discrete hooks for 5 compositions and never go on and continue writing that composition. Just write the 5 hooks. That would be an example of targeting a practice on something that they need practice on. And it turns out that your grade school piano teacher was correct when she gave you the words of wisdom that said, don't practice for 2 hours 1 day a week right before your lesson. Better to practice 7 days a week for 20 minutes, because it's about the frequency of practice that's important. What we really want to do is to wrap those neural networks in myelin so that they become efficient. So the practicing is the notion of repetition, redundancy. And once you get really good at something, then we can move to practice with variation, because then you need to be able to practice and see various conditions in which to use something. So using that same example of a composition hook, you might now ask the student to write a beginning hook to bring in the reader to read a friendly letter, to read a business letter, to read a newspaper article, as well as writing a hook for an essay or composition. Okay, and the second part of this gear, which is practicing and feedback gear, is the feedback part. And the feedback, the obvious reason for feedback is that you don't want students practicing errors. So the sooner they get specific and targeted feedback on their practice, the more likely they're going to have correction built in and be practicing something correctly. Various ways to give students feedback that won't kill you off. One way to give them feedback is to provide them with a rubric, which is simply 4 or 5 key characteristics of an assignment with 2 or 3 proficiency levels within, so they can use that as a blueprint for doing their assignment. Another way to give students feedback is to have them meet in a group of 4 random students, work on a common problem together, discuss it to the extent that everyone understands how the problem is solved, how they got the answer, and what they believe to be the correct answer. And then the teacher calls on one student at random from all the 6 or 7 or 8 groups to come to the chalkboard and write the problem on the chalkboard, and then everybody gets feedback in total. And in essence, if I go to the board with the problem, he still gets feedback because he was part of the group that worked that problem. Another interesting way to give students feedback is by using what we're calling exam wrappers. I know you break out your heart when you write all these information on a student, particularly on a midterm exam, because you know that the feedback you give them on a midterm exam they can potentially use for other exams coming along the road in your course. But what do they do when they get the exam? What do they look at first? They look at the grade. They're happy with it or they're not happy with it. But the notion of an exam wrapper is that you, again, provide them with a handout, and you typically will ask them 3 pieces of information on that handout. One is to ask them, what were they particularly successful in doing in that assignment? So they have to analyze their growth, what their strengths are. Second question you might ask would be, what were some of the weaknesses that they had on that particular assignment? And what were the patterns? Because if they can come up with patterns of weaknesses, they can learn that for the next go-round. And thirdly, and this is really key, is ask them about their preparation. How much time did they put in? What kind of study techniques did they use? If they did really well on the exam or assignment, they'll know to repeat that. If they didn't do that well, they'll know that they'll need to alter that in some way so that they'll do better for next time. So this basically represents the whole notion of practicing with feedback.
One of the things that I'd like to mention here is the idea of what I call closing the feedback loop. And what you do there is develop a technique, and with larger classes, the technique that I've come up with is email, the use of email. And so when I make comments on my students' papers, I have them email me back an explanation of what did that comment mean and what would they have done differently based now on the feedback that I gave them. And so what that does is that ensures that instead of me just writing comments over and over again, it actually brings closure to it and makes sure, at least in that one area, they understood what I was telling them was either incorrect or could have been strengthened. And so it closes that feedback loop. Now, in science in particular, science is actually geared for feedback. We are very much, when you understand the nature of science, when a question comes up and it can be tested, we just test it. And then we can learn from whatever the results are, whether it proved what we were looking for or it gave us a different result. Either one of those is good information in science. And so you get feedback immediately on what you found. You can get it from colleagues working in groups, as you said. And so feedback is just a very important component in science. And so it fits right in with this.